Hello, I'm Russell Michaels. Thank you for joining me and welcome to Cine Politics, where we discuss the social and, of course, the political issues which have inspired all kinds of films and all kinds of documentaries from all around the world. And on today's programme, we're discussing the compelling documentary, The War You Don't See, by veteran filmmaker and war correspondent John Pilger. Pilger asks the uncomfortable question, has the mainstream media become a willing partner in rapacious war-making? His unflinching investigation holds to account journalists and news broadcasters whom he accuses of failing to hold politicians to account, particularly over the conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan and Israel and Palestine. Witnesses and former government insiders speak out, and graphic footage of civilian deaths reveals the consequences of wars which British and American viewers rarely see on their televised news. Pilger's film asks, what is the role of the media in wars? Why do many journalists beat the drums of war regardless of the lies of governments? And how are the crimes of war reported and often justified?
These days we have 24-hour news. The sound bites never stop, and the wars never stop. Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine. This film is about the war you don't see. Drawing on my own experience as a war correspondent, it will look mainly at television, concentrating on the most popular channels in America and Britain. This is the Pentagon, which spends almost $1 billion a year just on advertising, recruiting, propaganda, the selling of war.
There are Pentagon contracts with news organizations in terms of how to manipulate the news. There are Pentagon officials involved in press releases that go to the media in which intelligence is used to manipulate public opinion, which is a violation of the charter of any intelligence organization. Then you have retired generals who serve as press spokesmen for all the networks, and it's never revealed which military-industrial firms they work for.
Central to this is the co-opting and spinning of a media regarded as the freest in the world.
Showdown Iraq. If America goes to war, turn to MSNBC and The Experts.
Scores of American reporters have now joined U.S. military units in Kuwait as part of the Pentagon's effort to make any war with Iraq what the Pentagon calls a media-friendly campaign.
If we journalists, including myself, had right from the get-go, from the opening pop, had started asking the kind of tough, digging, aggressive questions we should have been asking, and doing our reporting, rather than just being kind of stenographers, go to a briefing, have an official say something, print it in the paper next day. If we had done our job, I do think a strong argument can be made that perhaps we would not have gone to war.
So, have many journalists reporting wars allowed themselves to become propaganda tools? And are journalists ever threatened or sanctioned if they report against their own governments in matters of war? Well, here to discuss the war you don't see are my guests. James Denslow, Middle East security expert and war reporter for The Guardian. And we have Ian Hayden-Smith, editor of the International Film Guide. Very warm welcome to the programme to you both. I'd start with you, Ian. How shocking was that admission from Dan Rather that maybe journalists could have stopped the war? Well, there's an argument to say that maybe they could have. And how different could the 6 months have been running up to the invasion of Iraq, which was a marketing campaign, really, by the warmongers?
It's a remarkable admission, but it's very hard to imagine the whole situation being any different to how it was. You had a nation feeling a sense that they were wronged. They'd been attacked, and that attack was linked to Iraq, right or wrong, and it's now been proven that it's wrong.
So you mean 9/11 and the images?
9/11, yeah.
The images from it.
And following that, you had a culture of fear, and corporations who own the newspapers and the different media conglomerates deciding that they were going to back the war. I just can't imagine a situation being any different to the one that actually came to be.
Do you think, though, that the culture of fear and the climate of fear could have been made different or helped if the media had said, hang on, let's check this?
Yeah, but I think the amount of pressure that was being placed on the media, and also orders coming down from the top in different media companies, put too much pressure on journalists. And perhaps, yes, some should have stood up and said differently, but I just can't see how they could have at that point in time.
Well, James, what is the point of a 24-hour, highly technologically advanced, travelling all over the world news service if it gets it this wrong?
Well, I think in this case, clearly power wasn't held to account. You can't treat the media as if it's one sort of body that acts the same. Clearly there were parts of the media that did challenge this story, and the run-up to war in Iraq was highly controversial here in the United Kingdom. In fact, you could argue that it almost did prevent Britain entering the war, and it got so bad that the Americans eventually provided to the Brits. They said, listen, if you want to sit this one out, you can. But Blair had committed himself to the war, and that was regardless of any media scrutiny, it would seem.
Do you think that, I mean, one journalist in the film is David Rose, who wrote for the Observer. He calls himself an accomplice. He says, yes, unwitting, but I was an accomplice in selling this war. Do you think that in Britain, at least, had journalists really been on the ball and really asked the questions, that just here in Britain we could have had a vote in Parliament that would have stopped the war?
Yes, as I say, I think there was a huge amount of pressure on it anyway. If there'd been more accurate media reporting, that would have been even more so. And this film had a sense of almost a belated apology from certain journalists who essentially feel that they were duped. They took the official line, they believed in the sort of secretive world of intelligence, and that was giving them something that others didn't know, and that access to that meant that they were privy to something such as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And that was the story, and that was the narrative, and before we knew it, we were at war.
And an exciting story as well, rather than, no, it's not really happening. There's a much bigger excitement saying there's a danger.
Well, I think the whole point about this film trying to show is that journalists are worried about losing access to politicians. They're worried about losing the very kind of meat and drink of their job, and in doing so they will toe a line, especially if that line is forcefully given to them, as it was in this case.
OK, well, let's pause there and see a clip where we learn of underreported facts which contradict what most US and UK television news and newspapers were broadcasting before the invasion of Iraq.
Charles Hanley, who won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting, was in Iraq in January of 2003, and he went to all the sites that had been named by Bush officials as suspicious sites, El Tuwaitha and Fallujah. He went to every site that had been named by George Bush, Cheney, Rice, Colin Powell, and he found that in every case they were still sealed since 1991 when they had been sealed by UN inspectors. He filed a report on January 18th. It went to every major newsroom in the United States because it's the AP, which goes to every major newsroom in the United States. Got no pickup. No one published the script. It didn't fit the script. It got virtually no pickup. It didn't fit the script. We were going to war no matter what.
If I had to quantify Iraq's threat in terms of weapons of mass destruction, the real threat is zero. None.
The former chief weapons inspector, Scott Ritter, was saying as early as 1998 that Saddam Hussein was completely disarmed. Scott Ritter, I think, appeared in 2003 twice, and once at 3 in the morning on BBC 24 News. He was a vital expert witness, and there were others.
Well, I don't know why Scott Ritter didn't appear more, but he clearly did appear at times.
That's the question for the BBC. Why weren't those who were
Why weren't those
witnesses
voices heard?
Yes.
Well, because there were also other voices that we were putting on the air. Unscombe, Mohammed al-Baradei, Hans Blix. So we were actually listening to those voices. But yeah, I think you've got a good point. You know, why didn't we? It's a question that we asked ourselves afterwards. Why was it that we didn't discover this first? Didn't discover the state of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction?
Ian, in the film, John Pilger kind of grills the BBC head of news gathering and also the ITV editor. But Scott Ritter at least did appear a couple of times. He was a very important testifier about evidence of Saddam's WMD. But I don't think he appeared very much in America at all. How does this film kind of balance and evaluate the UK news with the US?
It sort of bundles them all together. I do think this is a very fine film. I think that should be said. And it's important that it was screened on prime time in the UK, the early part of it, I think in early January. And it's rare that you see a film as important as this being screened on television these days. So I think that's a very good thing. But part of the problem I have with this programme of this film is that right at the start we're told that Fox are almost the joke and we shouldn't really bundle them together with all the other news channels. And yet, because their news is so entertaining on a very macabre level, we keep returning to them. And with the exception of the interviews with the BBC news gathering head and with ITV, I just have a sense that everything's being clumped together, American journalism, British journalism, and as James said, I think there's a very different opinion coming out from the UK.
And Fox News particularly tried to sell the visuals. It had a waving American flag in the corner of the screen 24 hours
It's like an American movie trailer.
Yeah, they're like a reality show in some ways. James, what kind of sanctions do journalists face if they're going to say, no, we won't go with the official story, and particularly with embedded journalists? What kind of sellout, in a way, was that? Were they allowing themselves to be tools of propaganda?
Well, it's a very interesting development, the whole emergence of the embed, and there was some 700 journalists were embedded in the 2003 invasion, and I think it shows you how able the US military was to control the message, because they were controlling the deliverers of that message. To be embedded is to be with the troops, to see what the troops see, to have them as your protectors, to rely on them to a huge degree for your life. And therefore it will always dilute the story and the way you see it objectively, and of course the way you interact with anyone you meet who's a civilian, because you're seen as essentially a soldier. So I think that the whole embed process is a fascinating one. Also, of course, what happens to those journalists who aren't embedded? There was a huge number of deaths of journalists in Iraq, many of whom were unembedded and killed by US forces by accident. So I think it's a real kind of question we have to ask ourselves, is this the true objective way to report wars?
What about the ownership of news channels themselves? The film doesn't go into that, Ian, but is it important that we kind of know if, for example, General Electric owns NBC, which it does?
Yeah, it comes down to where revenues come from. And the fact is, if you have advertisers who are paying millions every year who don't like news content, is the media company going to turn around and say, right, OK, we're going to sacrifice that advertising because we want to stick by our journalists? Or are they going to try and change the news, alter the news, so that it keeps the advertisers happy? There's a huge amount of revenue being made from these stations. I think Fox is the largest earner.
And perhaps hidden agendas that we don't know about. Let's pause there and see a clip where John Pilger interviews Wikileaks controversial founder Julian Assange, and we see US military video footage which Wikileaks released and which contains disturbing images.
Wikileaks has released hundreds of thousands of secret Pentagon documents that describe the wholesale killing of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the information that you have revealed on Wikileaks about these so-called endless wars, what has come out of them?
Looking at the enormous quantity and diversity of these military or intelligence apparatus insider documents, what I see is a vast, sprawling estate, what we would traditionally call the military intelligence complex or military industrial complex, and that this sprawling industrial estate is growing, becoming more and more secretive, becoming more and more uncontrolled. This is not a sophisticated conspiracy controlled at the top. This is a vast movement of self-interest.
In April 2010, WikiLeaks released this cockpit video from an Apache gunship in Baghdad in 2007. The gunship is firing from a distance of over a mile from its victims. This is the war you don't see.
Clearly, there were two cameramen there holding cameras, not arms. These cameramen turned out to be Reuters news reporters.
You're clear. All right, firing. Line here. What's the stage line out? Let me know when you gather. What shoot? Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260s.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot.
Bushmaster 2-6. Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
It's quite shocking stuff, probably normal for a war like that. James, how important was the release of this footage last year, and is this evidence basically of a war crime?
Well, I think what Pilger's trying to say is that if investigative journalism is dead, the new mode of things is perhaps this transparency of Wikileaks and the new form in which Assange has delivered us knowledge about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that we never really knew. And nothing is more visceral than seeing the evidence of a massacre from the gun sight of a helicopter itself. So I think what WikiLeaks represents and what this particular clip represents is a wake-up call for those who were not aware of the real consequences of the war in Iraq.
What did you see in this, there's more of it in the film obviously, that makes you think that this isn't just some misdirected firers of bullets, this is actually a crime? Or something that was inappropriate to the point of, there should be an investigation?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious for anyone who sees it. You see a bunch of people hanging around, no obvious sign of weapons, nothing at all threatening from them. They're not even aware that a helicopter's watching them, and they're all killed. And it shows you that a sort of a war that is supposedly fought for the people, amongst the people, had incredibly lax rules of engagement that allowed for such mechanised slaughter. And you saw later on a member of the Marines who came to deal with these casualties look to rescue a child, and the callous response of the helicopter pilots shows you a view of life and death that is completely unacceptable, and that's why the war crime element comes into it.
And they continue firing as they try to rescue the injured as well. So Ian, why, can I ask you, do you think are images, particularly in the UK, as a UK consumer of news, censored? Why are graphic images that you might see on other channels in other parts of the world of an incident like that not shown to the British public? There's
a strange dichotomy that you have many news programmes saying the images are too shocking to show you, or will prepare us for an image. It doesn't seem as often these days where we're told you're about to see something shocking, and yet in mainstream entertainment we can watch incredibly graphic violence. It's an odd question, really, of why we're not being allowed to see footage, shocking footage, real footage, especially after a watershed.
Well, are civilian deaths being downgraded in the news as well? There were some soldiers shot here, but we don't bother so much about the civilians. And yet that's the greatest casualty. I mean, Fallujah, most people who died, we believe, I think, were civilians.
Yeah, I think it comes into this sort of rolling force of people in favour of the conflict, and seeing so many civilian deaths on our television screens would actually work against that campaign. And then we go back to embedded journalists who are not being allowed to see this.
Well, the ITV news editor-in-chief in the film, James, says, well, journalists can't change the world, and kind of distances himself from the responsibility, really. Do you agree with that? What about Watergate? Watergate had two journalists who did change the world, the course of history. If they're not holding power to account, is this actually a threat to democracy? Bush and Blair were re-elected. Perhaps they might not have had the media done its job.
Well, some of the most interesting documents that came out from the WikiLeaks files showed that the US military perceived investigative journalists to be just as much of a danger as opposition fighters and terrorists. So clearly the truth is a very dangerous thing, and nowhere more so than when you're fighting unpopular wars where civilian body counts are a barometer of success. Therefore it is in your interest to minimise the damage seen from large casualties. In Afghanistan we saw a case of an airstrike that killed a large number of people in a village. It was reported as a few people killed by NATO. It took an investigative journalist on the ground, as this film showed, to literally see the bodies to work out that no, it was far more than that. So of course it's a hugely important element, and if we don't have it we will never truly hold power to account.
Apparently the MOD, the Ministry of Defence in Britain, does review filmed footage from journalists, but the Pentagon does it. How does that potentially briefly change how a journalist might report?
Well, it's another layer of censorship. Already we're talking about the impact of being embedded with the soldiers. If you're with the soldiers and then what you produce is also edited, then the distance you have from the truth is greater still.
Fascinating. Well, let's pause there and see our last clip, where John Pilger investigates how Israeli officials try to influence British journalists and broadcasters.
The pioneering Glasgow University Media Group has just published its latest study on the media reporting of Israel and Palestine.
I think what it comes down to is a basic knowledge that journalists have, which is quite simply that if they criticise Israel, then it's potentially trouble. If they criticise the Palestinians, then there is much less of a problem. After we did the first book, I gave a number of talks to journalists in Britain, to BBC journalists, and I spent time with people who were senior producers on television news. And one of them said to me, in the context of quite a heated discussion that was going on with other journalists, he said, listen, he said, we wait in fear. That was his exact words. We wait in fear for the telephone call from the Israelis. He said the only issue we face then is how high up it's come from them. Has it come from a monitoring group? Has it come from the Israeli embassy? And then how high has it gone up our organisation? Is it the duty editor? Has it gone above that? Is it the director general? He said, I have had journalists on the phone to me minutes before we've gone on a major news programme saying, what can I say? Which words can I use? Is it all right if I say this?
Ian, beyond that interview, the film uses the attack on the flotilla, the aid flotilla, as a kind of example of skewed reporting or propaganda by the Israelis. Do you think that was a strong current conflict and it works?
Yeah, It works in the context of the sequence it's in the film. I know that when John Pilger was interviewed on Radio 4's Today programme, they said that he segues into his bête noire, Israel. And I did feel that there was a sense that though this was important, it took the focus away from the main theme of the film.
But we could be looking backwards all the time at Iraq, so that's the danger, isn't it? That you don't want to. You want to focus on things happening now as well.
No, but I think he, right at the start of the film, he presents a history over the 20th century of reporting and showing how reporting can be skewed. So I don't think we have a sense of a one-off instance of journalism and where it goes wrong. I think we have a sense of a history and that it will continue to happen.
James, the drums of war, are they beating again, is kind of how the film ends. Based on the failures over Iraq particularly, what has the media, the press, British, learned? And are there any changes in the way that decisions and reporting is made?
Well, it's the $1 billion question. Have we really learnt from the mistakes of the past? And ultimately, if we haven't, then we're doomed to repeat them. I don't feel there's been any significant structural change in the way the media operates. Certainly, there's been no dilution of, say, corporate media control over the news agenda. That hasn't changed. I think we can hope that things have changed, but ultimately, it will take the test of time to see if they have.
Do you think that trust in your job from your readers and your public has been damaged?
Of course, and I think that the Wikileaks documents have shown that perhaps the public want something that's a bit more raw to see the real kind of story here, rather than something that's so managed and airbrushed and controlled. And I think that will be the test of things to come.
Very briefly, Ian, do you think the public cares enough?
I would like to think they do. I have a worry that the public seems more concerned about celebrity and very superficial things than what's happening in other parts of the world, because there seem very few complaints against the press compared to things like the Jonathan Ross farrago in this country last year.
We have to pause, finish there, but let's hope that people care enough for the next problem to be revealed and truthfully. Thank you. A warm thank you to my guests, James Denslow and Ian Hayden-Smith. And also thank you, and I hope you'll join us again at the same time next week. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear your views too, of course, so please do email us at the address on the screen, cinepolitics@presstv.co.uk, or you can join our Facebook fan page for the latest news and join the debate with your questions or, of course, any suggestions for future films to discuss. But for now, goodbye.